Hello team and welcome to another ATP, Atypical Philosopher video discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this is a series that I started in the previous video by looking at morality and getting some basic understanding of some of the concepts concerned with morality, because we might need to be using them later or knowing about them at least. And also talking about my biases, about how we all have biases and we need to kind of check them so that we understand who we are and how we are approaching different subjects. And I was talking about whether I would have some kind of implicit or intuitive biases that favor Judaism and Israel, modern Israel, as opposed to Islam and Palestine, perhaps Hamas, and what is going on with what baggage am I bringing to the table when I discuss these entities. And that's really important for us all to do, to really understand why you believe things, not what you believe, but why you believe them. This will perhaps allow you to unlock these puzzles as to what is accurate, what is inaccurate, how you've come to believe things, and what is the truth in the middle of this bundle of this tangled web of claims and counterclaims and information and misinformation and so on and so forth. So it's really important to understand our own thinking. Okay. I didn't talk about one of my biases, which is that I am British. I mean, I did mention that, but actually that could affect me because the British Empire was heavily involved in some of the history concerning what took place, particularly in the 20th century, with regard to the geographical area. But we're going to actually start a long time before that. We're going to go back to ancient Israel, ancient Palestine. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about nations and borders. People's misunderstanding of borders and nations can lead them down a certain path, some kind of nationalism that gets them fighting over what are essentially arbitrary accidents of history and geography. Perhaps not arbitrary, perhaps there are good reasons why borders developed through history and geography, but they're in a kind of way arbitrary. So rather, like I said with morality in the previous video, I don't think morality exists out there. We construct it in here. When we agree on it, hey, we can have like-minded fellows that we get on with, and then we can think about voting in people who represent our moral views. And then society can hopefully, if we have good, fair and functioning democracy, can be a contest to a fair contest to try and establish our set of rules, as opposed to a group of people who disagree with us if we have majority political representation. But we're not, the morality isn't in some ether out there. Why it's important to go back to that is because that kind of underwrites my opinions as to what borders are. So when we look at a map, when we look at a map of the world, a map of Israel or Palestine, or different parts in history, when we look at a map of Europe, of the US, maps change. Physical geography can change, but human geography certainly changes throughout history. And what was a border at one point in history might not be a border now, or might have shifted. There isn't an understanding of all the countries in the world that exist out there. The understanding of countries in the world exists in here. And when we all agree on what these countries are, these nations are, and when we agree on what their borders are, we write atlases and maps. And in fact, some countries try and redraw those maps. We've had just this year China trying to redraw their map to include parts of Russia and other countries around. I think there's some issues to do with India as well, and so on and so forth. So these aren't set in stone, and these change over time, and they usually change with regard to conquest. We can look at history. I mean, it's funny how Europeans often talk about how Israel-Palestine conflict is this long-lasting warring conflict, actually it's not particularly, and it's certainly no more bellicose than the history of Europe, where the map has changed consistently every decade, every 100 years, every epoch, because our history, human history, has involved warring tribes and warring city states and warring nations, trying to get the resources of this area, trying to get control over this area. The British did a really good job of sailing around the world and sticking flags in other people's countries and saying, have you got a bigger army and as much technology we have? No, you haven't. Right, we own you now, and we'll now start exploiting you for X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's how empires work, right? And so maps change, borders change. It's very difficult to say Britain is this particular area of land, or France is this particular area of land, when you include other bits of land that have come and gone uh, over history in terms of empires, but also in terms of your core country, if you like, over time. Well, that used to be part of the UK, but isn't now, or that used to be part of France, but isn't now. Which point of time is correct? Now, which map is correct? Well, no maps are correct. They are just a representation of where humanity is at a point in time. And even at any given point in time, there will be some people who disagree with how those maps are written. There'll be some people disagree about what's going on with Tibet and China, what's going on with the Karabakh area in Azerbaijan, with Armenia. People would disagree over Kashmir. So there is this element of it not being out there in the ether, that there is no kind of true, if you like, map of the world. It's a changing thing, and we don't necessarily all agree with it. So therefore, it comes down to consensus. Now, when we have voting in global institutions like the UN or this group, the EU or that group or whatever, then we can start getting some kind of more structured consensus that has a kind of legal binding. But someone still may disagree with that, and they've got every right to disagree with that. And they're only, scare quotes, wrong on account of they're in the minority, right? So a bunch of people saying I have rights to this land is effectively, at base level, comes down to, well, let's have a fight about it. Okay, if you are stronger and you can establish yourself on this land, then that's kind of how it works. It's like a chimpanzee troop. That's the same kind of idea. Is you establish your area, your territory, and you show yourself to be stronger than other people who are claiming that territory as theirs, and then eventually that becomes normalized and accepted. And when society then creates more and more rules, and you have international rules, you start getting nation states, and then you start getting organizations that take into account members that are those nation states. Then you start having this structure and these rules that make it all seem so much more official. But essentially, at the base, it is one group of people saying, "This is our land, and it ain't yours." So that I think it's worth kind of remembering that, because we've got to a point in society where we've moved from tribes, from hunter-gatherers to tribes to larger settlements, and then you moved through collective farming and specialization of jobs. So we start working together more and more as humanity, and then we moved up to cities and city states. So we didn't have nations until relatively recently. So who was right? Were we wrong then? Are we wrong now? Or there's no such thing as right and wrong. It's just ways of living. And then we went from the way of living of having city states, which, if you are going to look at ancient Palestine, for example, when you are going to look at the ancient times, we moved, or they in that time period moved from city states to kind of kingdoms, and then eventually, much later on, uh, nation states. And in fact, that was still being established relatively late, given what we're going to go on to probably in the next video, things like the Balfour Declaration and things like that you may have heard about. But I just want to establish like the kind of ancient history first. Now, I'm going to do something that some of you might go, oh my God, what are you doing this for in a geopolitical video? But this is also a philosophical video. And we need to understand history, I think, a little bit more critically than maybe many people do. So and this is really pertinent to obviously people like Jews understanding their right to that land. Okay, so you have something called the Bible, and the Hebrew Bible in particular. And in the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament for Christians, you have the Torah, or the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And those 5 books are supposed to have been written, tradition says, by Moses, right? And that was supposed to be the time period of around 1200 BCE. And then there was this covenant with God, so on and so forth. All right. As you know, I'm an atheist philosopher, and I'm actually writing a book on this time period at the moment. That doesn't see it that way at all. Right. So if I don't believe that God exists, then of course no one's having a covenant to agree on a particular area of land. Right. So but let's just try and understand history. So people like Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Christians will understand the history of this area to be represented by the Bible. The Bible is a historical document for them. And out of that, you had archaeologists that went to this area, and you had this school of thought called biblical maximalism. So biblical maximalism essentially takes the Bible and says, right, I'm not going to do any evidence hunting. I'm going to assume the Bible is historically true. And then I'm going to look for the evidence to support the Bible. But I start with the truth of the Bible. And what the archaeologists did, and bear in mind, they were paid by seminaries. So the original archaeologists would go to places like, ancient Israel or ancient Palestine and say, right, we're going to dig around. Now, we know King David ruled at this time period, and we know that this happened at that time period because it says it in the Bible. And so when we get to a certain strata in the rocks, we're going to find some pottery, and we know, right, this accords with this time period, and we know that's King David, so this was King David, and then everything under that is blah, blah, blah. And the benchmarking of different points in history was benchmarked by the Bible. And that's to say the Bible is maximally true, and everything else fits to the Bible. So whatever we find in the dirt, whatever we find in the earth, has to fit to the Bible narrative. And then eventually people found that doesn't really work, right? So eventually over time, it's like, yeah, but that's not what we're finding. And actually we can't, that doesn't jive with that. And yeah, that's a contradictory to that claim. And it looks like the Bible might not be true on some of these claims. And you started getting critical analysis of the Bible, and you had the other end of the spectrum. So the other end of the spectrum is people like the late Philip Davis. So Philip Davis, for example, was a biblical minimalist, right? So biblical minimalism goes the other way. And it basically says that we need to forget that the Bible even existed, or like we're not going to take our supposed facts from the Bible. We're just going to do some archaeology. We're going to look at other historical sources, and we're going to build up our understanding of history outside of the Bible. And if some of it accords with the Bible, then whoop-de-doo. But essentially, we're not starting with that as a historical foundation to the work we're going to do. And so biblical minimalism has grown and grown and now we like there's more of a center ground. People like Israel Finkelstein of the Bible Unearthed, he's more on the minimalist front, but you have this is a book between him, Israel Finkelstein, and Amihai Mazdar, who is more of a moderate, which is someone in the middle that says, okay, there'll be elements of truth in the Bible, but we need to do like external work to try and see if that's true or not. And anyway, so I think it's important that you know this for future reference for where we're going to go. So what you ended up having happen was that people were doing archaeology and finding out that actually the Bible wasn't really backed up by the archaeological evidence. Yeah, there are still people like Kenneth Kitchen who are biblical maximalists, who I would disagree with, and most modern scholars would say doesn't really fit the evidence. But there are still these arguments because for a lot of people who are Christian and uh, and Jewish, they need that to be true, and they need it to be true because otherwise it calls into question the basis of their belief. And so that has to be true. So they start with the Bible and say, right, but that is history. But for most kind of secular scholars and modern scholars, that's not the case. One of the biggest things to support this, and you understand why this is relevant in a second. One of the biggest things to support this are the Elephantine papyri, which are really interesting. So what are these? The Elephantine papyri are these thousands of documents, as it says here, that were found at the Egyptian border, and they date to sort of 5th and 4th centuries BCE. And why these are absolutely fascinating is because they give us a picture of what Judaism actually believed at the time. And it turns out that in this particular area, at least, Judaism was polytheistic, which meant they actually believed in many gods, not just Yahweh, the one God. So we read here from the wiki page, the Elephantine papyri predate all extant manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. So there are no Hebrew Bibles before this time, right? There are none in existence. Hebrew Bibles are very late, but the claim is they were written 1200 BC plus, when Moses was alive. He even wrote about his own death. Okay, so that's interesting. So the Elephantine papyri gives scholars a very important glimpse into Judaism and how it was practiced in Egypt during the 5th century BCE. They show clear evidence in the existence in around 400 BCE of polytheistic, at least, sect of Jews. It is widely agreed that this Elephantine community originated in the mid-7th or mid-6th centuries BCE, likely as a result of Judean and Samaritan refugees fleeing into Egypt during the times of the Assyrian and Babylonian invasions. And we're going to get to that because that's a super important part of history. They seem to have no knowledge of the written Torah, no knowledge of the Bible. There was no knowledge of the Bible at the time, or the narratives described therein. They didn't mention in all of these letters and writings and documents, they didn't mention the major names in the Bible. It's incredible, right? And that has led some scholars in modern times to argue that the Elephantine papyri demonstrate that monotheism, belief in one God, and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, could not have been established in Jewish culture before 400 BCE. So not written in 1200 plus, but 400. And that the Torah was therefore likely written in the Hellenistic period in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Okay, right. Now let's go on to a greater understanding of this the history here. So that's to say that there wasn't this agreement with God, and that Judaism wasn't what we think it is now. It didn't exist then. That was something that developed. And as you had these sort of kingdoms, you did have Jews living here, but you had Philistines living, you had Phoenicians living, there were all sorts of different peoples living. And throughout history, there were different invasions, as you can well imagine. If we think about going from city states to these kingdoms, you then had the Babylonians invading from the east, invading into this area and putting the Israelites, if you like, or the peoples of that time in exile. And it was in this exile time period in sort of the 500s that the claim from many modern scholars is that because they were exiled and they had no sense of national unity and identity, that it was then that the Bible was written, and it gave them their stories of their culture. It gave them cultural identity. So they wrote the Bible in exile, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, and then after that other books came on after it, and that was a very late established book. So when we try and understand the idea that Jews say that they have a right to this land because they've got this agreement with God, first of all, it means you have to believe in that God, which I don't. And second of all, um, we can't actually evidence that from the timing, the history, and the books written at the time. And you also get an interesting scenario where you get certain Jews who say, so certain Orthodox Jews that do not believe in the modern iteration of Israel. So here you can see, like, Torah observant Jews, Orthodox Jews standing on the flag of Israel. So what's going on here, and why are they waving the flag of Palestine? Um, well, because they believe that Israel can only be given to them by God. So they are waiting for God to reestablish Israel, and it can't be established from, the British rulers of Palestine at the time doing some kind of agreement and so on and so forth. Humans basically agreeing on what Israel is. So they say, actually, we, who you might think are the most hardcore Jews, are saying no. This iteration of Israel isn't correct. So the Jewish people do not need Israel to exist, they say, at least according to this source. We've been around for thousands of years. Jews lived in the land of Israel long before the founding of Israel. In fact, they lived in harmony with their Muslim neighbors. Torah Jews want the land seized by the Zionists to be returned to the Palestinian people. Okay, so what you had happen was you had a lot of invasions going on, and then over time, Jews moved out of this area and moved to diaspora communities. And over time, you got this development, a kind of Zionism, where they wanted to move back to Israel. But in the intervening period, I mean, initially you had Alexander the Great. So after the Babylonian invasions and the Persian invasions, you had Alexander the Great taking over this whole area, and so it became Hellenized, which means Greekized. So you had Greekized, Hellenized Jews and other Jews as well, and you had differentiation even within, like, the Jewish groups there. And then you had the Roman Empire then turned up, and because they wanted to dislocate Judaism from, say, Jerusalem, they named this area Palestine. And that is, of course, pretty significant. Now, some people might debate whether that was exactly what the Romans were trying to do, but nevertheless, there was this new era of Roman rule. And you had client kingdoms where, for example, Herod the Great was the kind of ruler of the area, but he would have to pay tributes to Rome, so on and so forth. And then after that, we went into, like, the Byzantine period, which at the beginning of that, there was quite a bit of Christian persecution. But then after that, there was the Roman Empire took on Christianity as its state religion. And there was sort of a lot more interest in that area from that respect. You started having churches built. It was flourishing, particularly with that Christian influence as well. But then after that, you have the development of Islam. So Islam as a religion is a late religion. Just to remind people that it's an Abrahamic religion, which means that Muslims, Christians, and Jews all believe in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And those are the stories that give the foundation to the belief systems that are built onto that. So for Jews, it kind of stops after the Hebrew Bible, and they have their own rabbinic writings and whatnot to go with that. For the Christians, you build on the New Testament, which is the life of Jesus that's built onto the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And for Muslims, you have that as a kind of basis for the Quran, which pertains to the life of Muhammad and the teachings thereof. So they are all, from the same book. Well, the Muslim religion is a late developer, so sort of 6th century CE, and then after that, you started getting sort of invasions and Muslim control of the area. But as we go through time, we can see that different peoples were living in and controlling different areas or all of that area, such that, there were tribes of people, then towns of people, then cities of people, and then belief systems or areas identified with belief systems. And then you had Judaism that sprouted out of that, and Christianity that then sprouted out of that. But they were competing. And then later you had Islam that again sprouted out of the same book, right? So it's very difficult to say, kind of from any point now, looking back at it, who was right, who owned that land, who has the rights to that land. People live there and they control it, and then at some point later in time they're invaded and someone else controls it, and then they're invaded and someone else controls it. Who really has the right to it? Well, no one has a right to a land. If you're living there at a time, hopefully we have international rules whereby you have human rights that are enshrined into at least international law. But the problem is, if it's not enshrined to your own law when you're living there, you are vulnerable to be taken advantage of by whoever else is around. And this is a big point we're going to come back to later in this series, which is the importance of a functioning democracy. When we can look at Hamas, when we look at Palestine and compare it to Israel and say, where do we want this thing to go? Because wherever you want it to go, it needs to include a functioning democracy, because that's how you get people's right to a self-determination. That's how it manifests. And so it's so important. Anyway, going back to this time period, which is anywhere from ancient times right up to the kind of, let's go to the 19th century, you have shifting sands of control of people, and you'll have cultures establishing themselves. So the Jewish culture established itself, the Christian culture tried to get their version of reality stamped onto that area, and then you had Muslim culture after that, and you have this big melange, this big mix of those three religions and the cultures that go with it, and the people that live in those cultures, like making a claim to this same geographic area. And at certain times, they've lived in uneasy proximity, and at other times, it's been much more violent. And we can talk about the Saracens, we can talk about the Crusades, we can talk about these different time periods. But again, it's just going back to whether you want to use religion as a reason why you want to take over that land, or resources, or whatever. You have a group of people wanting to take over a geographical area, and if they have the might to do so, then they can do that. And if they don't, then they get repelled, and that's war. And this is what we see in Ukraine, and this is what, to a degree, we're seeing in Israel and Palestine. I don't know whether you could call it a war, a conflict, most certainly. And then that brings us to the medieval period, the Crusader era, the post-Crusader era, and into the early Ottoman rule in the 1400s and 1500s, and so on. And the name Palestine, it wasn't used. They named provinces after capitals and whatnot, but it was kind of a semi-officially used label. So the Ottomans were a ethnic Turkish group who founded the Ottoman Empire. That's the early modern era, and remained pretty dominant across this area for quite a long time. And that kind of brings us up to the First World War. That's where we really start seeing the modern history come to the fore. It's the Great War, I think, is the end of the Ottoman Empire's control over this region, and that's where we're going to take it next, because that, I think, is worth differentiating the 100 years after that from what went before. I mean, I've completely butchered the history, in all honesty, that's gone on before that, because so much has happened. My goodness, entire books have been written about single decades in those periods I've been talking about. But the general idea is that people move, people control areas. There is no objective truth or rightness to anyone's or any people's control of a land. No one's got a God-given right to this land. No one's got an objective right to this land. When you have people living in a place, you either live with them peacefully, or you eliminate them, or you displace them forcefully, or maybe you bribe them to move. Those are your options, and all of those, all of the above, will play a part in what happens in this area going forward from the point that we're at right now in history. So from the First World War onwards. We'll look in the next video at the 20th century, really, to get an understanding of where the modern conflict has come from and why. We'll talk about some of the major agreements or even disagreements concerning and decisions concerning the area. And then that should bring us back after the next video. It should bring us up to like the present time, where we can then work out, what the hell's just been going on recently, and then where we go from there. What are the moral implications and evaluations that we can make and understand? Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.